Pam Peirce is a teacher and author, and I would say somewhat a philosopher, and extremely knowledgeable person about gardening in our area, and not just vegetable gardening, but gardening in general. And she is going to help us understand how we can better focus our vegetable gardens to actually use the produce that we grow, which can sometimes be a real problem, especially if you have neighbors who aren't willing to take your produce off your hands when you have too much. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Pam Peirce, and let's get knowledgeable. Oh, Pam, you're muted.
I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning to all of you invisible gardeners. I know you're out there. I wish I could see you now and also during the talk. It's I miss the faces on Zoom, but I'm really happy to know that you're all out there, that you're getting to enjoy this talk. Today's webinar is about eating from your garden, and I'm going to give you some gardening tips and some philosophy, indeed, and some recipes and some photographs of both the crops and especially of the recipes. So I hope that my words and pictures will help you enjoy and get more joy out of your gardening as well as out of your cooking. To some, it might seem a bit quixotic to garden in the urban Bay Area. Food is so available in groceries and in farmers markets, and many of our garden spaces are small. We also are dealing with very high rent and home costs, which further, for some people, reduces the amount of space outdoors that they can afford to have. In much of San Francisco and the coastal Bay Area, we have rather cold summers. That prevents many of us from growing everything that we'd like to grow. But nevertheless, people do grow food in our area, even in the most ocean-influenced and urban areas. And in fact, far more people are growing food since the pandemic than were growing it before. So it's certainly a growing interest. Many people have yards and at least room for some containers, and others have a community garden space. I have a community garden space. It's 8 by 8 feet, which is large for a community garden in San Francisco, but very wonderful to have in a somewhat sunnier part of the city than my particular backyard. It's my observation that not everyone who grows food also eats everything that they grow or that they could eat that they've grown. And I think probably those who find it easiest are those who eat a lot of vegetables. They may be vegetarian or vegan. They may be on a very tight food budget. They may be trying to show children where food comes from. They may have grown up on a farm or had parents who had a farm or a big garden to learn from, as I did. My father had a large garden. I think the factors that set back many of us who would like to grow food and eat it are at least one of the following factors: little or no space to garden, unfamiliar climate and sequence of crops, difficulties producing the crops that one wants to eat, a life that moves too fast, the convenience of restaurants for those who can afford them. And especially before the pandemic, the enticement of travel and so many distractions that one forgets to plant or forgets to harvest and forgets to cook what one has planted. So where does garden raised food fit in all of this? And what can I tell you that will be helpful? I've set up a poll, and part of the poll are questions that I put there for you so that I can learn more about your gardening and how you cook from a garden. But as I haven't seen your response yet, I will try to make my presentation relevant for as many people as I possibly can. I'm not going to spend much time on growing food in containers or on finding a community garden or a space to share. if you don't have enough room yourself. The information on growing food in containers is in my book. It's in other books. And I suggest that you do seek a community garden if you need some more space, and or find a person that you can share with. I was just reading that Rosalind Creasy, who wrote Edible Landscaping and many books on cooking from your garden, started in a shared space that she was gardening with a friend. So I'm assuming that you're going to grow at least a bit of your garden produce, if even some herbs and vegetables in containers, and you want to learn to use more of what you can grow. And so the first question is to ask yourself is whether you are growing crops that you actually want to eat. Here's a place for both research and individuality. In my experience, the most common impediments to developing a garden of foods we want to eat are unfamiliarity with all the many different crops that are possible, and unfamiliarity with our local microclimates. So we don't know when and where to plant them. I encourage you to explore crops that grow in the cool summers and the mild winters near the coast, and in the mild winters inland, which are uniquely successful in our region. They don't do well in places that have really hot summers and really cold winters and really short springs and falls. But here, even inland, the winter is mild enough to grow many of the cool season crops. And so they're really excellent for us to try. If you find a crop that's easy to grow locally, but you really don't know much about it, I suggest that you buy some in the grocery or the farmer's market and collect some recipes for it and try it and see what you can find out if you like it. If you're growing something, it's already growing in your garden, but you really find that you're not eating it that much, try finding some recipes so that you have a go-to recipe for it when it's ready and you're all ready to eat it. The other thing to do is to think about what you're growing and whether you really like it, because if you don't, you should just stop growing it, that's all. And you shouldn't worry about having an eccentric list of crops that you grow. You don't have to follow the USDA principle of planting a row of this and a row of that. If you don't want to eat it, don't grow it. So you might find that what you really like is parsley, lettuce, some edible flowers, some oregano. That's it. It's all you want to grow. Grow just that. That's all you have to grow. Maybe what you will harvest is green beans, kale, arugula, and garlic bulbs. Okay, grow that. You'll make up your own eccentric list. It might be very short. It might be one thing that you know that you will eat, and it might be 2 or 3, but you don't have to plant everything. One topic I think it's useful for gardeners is that some crops need to have a more regular harvest than others. And in our busy lives, it's sometimes difficult to remember to harvest crops at the right time. So they get too mature to be edible and we get discouraged. It helps to know in advance what crops need frequent harvest and which ones can sit in the garden longer until we're ready to harvest them. And a rule of thumb is that any vegetable that we eat that would eventually contain ripe seeds needs to be picked often. So when we eat a lot of vegetables, they are immature fruits and they have a very short period of time when they're ready for us to eat. Examples are summer squash, cucumbers, peas, green beans, sweet corn, and broccoli. All of these except broccoli are immature fruits and we're picking them green. So we got to get out there before they turn ripe. I remember a community gardener once. I was in my community garden and a man asked me, he was looking at his fat, yellow, overripe cucumbers. And he asked me somewhat plaintively, when are they going to turn green? Oh, I hated to tell him. He had missed the harvest. They were never going back. And what's going to happen when those cucumbers have become fat and yellow and overripe is that they're going to ripen seeds, and then the plant is going to feel that it has fulfilled its purpose and it's going to stop making new fresh green cucumbers. So if you're the kind of harvester that only gets out occasionally to harvest, those are not the crops that you want to grow. If you eat if you're eating the ripe fruit, as we do with tomatoes or dry beans, there's a lot more leeway because they're already ripe, and the tomato plant, bless its heart, goes on, and if it's making any fruit at all, which sometimes it doesn't in the coastal areas, but if it's making it at all, it ripens some and then it ripens some more, so you can keep picking it. And dry beans can be picked over a wide period of time. You just want to pick them before the rains start. We do have rains sometimes in the fall, and that may cause them to decay. So once the pod is crisp, you have a pretty wide window of time when you've got to get out there and get them off the plant. And you do have to look. It's a good idea to look at your plants regularly to check them for pests and other problems. I had a friend who was he was a cartoonist, and he wanted to garden, and I gave him some tomato plants and he put them in. And for a visual artist, I thought he was remarkably unobservant. He asked me when he would have tomatoes, and I told him that once they had flowered and set little nubs of green, it would be 45 days until they were ripe. And I said, so are they flowering? And he said, I don't know. And I said, oh, well, how do the plants look? Have you looked at them? He said, they look kind of fluffy. And I thought, well, this is not the kind of observation skills that one needs to know when one is going to have a crop. So you do have to occasionally look. Most leafy crops and root crops and herbs are fairly forgiving, and many are biennials that will stay in your garden ready to harvest for a long time. And they will eventually flower probably in March and go to seed and die. But if you get them in before the coolest weather of fall starts, they will grow and hold in your garden all winter. They include things like kale, collards, cabbage, carrots, Swiss chard, and leeks. So those are very forgiving crops. And exceptions to the rule about leafy or root crops are a few plants that are really fast producing annuals. Spinach, cilantro, arugula, small radishes, and even lettuce is relatively quick to go to seed. So those are things that you need to pay attention. You need to probably replant and plant replant occasionally during the season so that you have some coming in fresh all the time. Note that earlier I suggested collecting some recipes. This is wise in general because it will remind you of the food in your garden, and you'll have something ready to go when that crop is ready to harvest, and it'll give you very fast ideas for preparing it. And some information that will be helpful in your search is learning to recognize recipes that are garden friendly. Eating from a garden is different from eating from the supermarket. Cookbooks may include a number of brand name products. They picture you harvesting from the supermarket shelves rather than harvesting from a garden. They may include things that are ripe in wildly different seasons because we can buy food from the Southern Hemisphere, and wherever it's ripe, we go and find it and buy it. It's closer to cooking from a farmer's market, but it's still even different from that. Or it may list the crops in units that a gardener doesn't understand. For example, I was once trying to make some salsa verde. I had harvested some tomatillos, some husked tomatoes, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to make my own green sauce? So I tried to find a recipe, and they all said 1 can of tomatillos. Well, I don't understand that. I mean, I don't know how many tomatillos is in a can. And so I kept looking, and I finally found a recipe that called for 20 large tomatillos about 1 1/2 inch in diameter. That I can understand. And that was from a Rosalind Creasy cookbook, and it's in one of the cookbooks. You have a list of cookbooks on one of your handouts. I presume that you can print out your handouts from the web. And there's a list, Edible Garden Series, and her newest book, which is apparently been out for a while. There's a new edition of it in 2021 from Recipes from the Garden. And it's in both the Mexican cookbook and the recipes from the garden. So these are cookbooks that I found particularly useful over the years. You may also scan newspapers or magazines for useful recipes, or you may sometimes look up ingredients or a combination of ingredients on the web. But when you are looking in those sources, you will find that you have to select the ones that are most useful to a gardener. Whereas if you have a cookbook that's intended for a gardener, that's a whole bunch of recipes that you can relate to right away. And when you look up book recipes in one of these cookbooks, when you look into cookbooks and you try to decide, is this a cookbook that's going to help me? You want certain things. Number one, you want the ingredients listed in units that a garden can measure, size or weight or counts, rather than cans or packages or something that it does not compute for you. Number two, you want lots of ingredients in the recipes that you can grow and a good index that records them. So in the past, cookbooks, even if they had vegetables in them, in the recipes, did not index those vegetables, so that it was very frustrating to look them up. That you'd have to kind of scan through the whole book and say, oh, look, there's a recipe for such and such, and I've got it. Now, more commonly, it's in the index, but ideally you'd have a lot of them in the index and a lot of vegetables in the crops, and herbs being used that you can grow that are in the recipes. 3, you want recipes with at least a couple of ingredients that are ready at the same season, so that you can harvest them together rather than only one that you have in your garden and a whole slew of things that you have to go and hunt up in a grocery store. And 4, it's especially nice when they include recipes that give you new uses for crops that you can produce in large quantities, or that you knew too few ways to use, or recipes that use the wee bits of this and that are frequently what you have in a small garden. You don't have a steady supply of things. You have especially the beginning and the ending of the season, you're going to have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and so a salad or an omelet or a soup or something like that or a stir fry that you can combine the different crops in is going to help you quite a bit. And 5, it's nice if they include recipes that use the less common crops or the wild plants that you can produce in a garden. I'll show you some pictures and talk about those in a few minutes. The farmer always include recipes created by farmers always include wild foods, because if you can eat it, you eat it. And so those are in the books. In fact, you'll find that recipes that are closer to traditional farm cuisine are the most helpful, because they cooked a lot of things directly from the garden and used those crops. But a caution about traditional cuisines is that they may be higher in saturated fat, an animal fat, than you intended to eat. So some of the more recent cookbooks have redesigned those. I redesign them myself all the time. It says 1 cup heavy cream. I say, oh, 1 cup non-fat dry milk reconstituted. I see. And it usually works really well. So, my feeling is you can make anything taste delicious if you use a cup of heavy cream, but you can probably make it delicious without that. So a lot of the new cookbooks will help you do that, and you can do it yourself. There are recipes in Golden Gate Gardening that I have found useful through the year, and I've put some more on my blog. And when I show you the photos shortly, I'm going to tell you on each photo of a dish where you can find it, where you can find that recipe. And several are on the handouts. I've given you 2 handouts. The second one has recipes on it. And before we dive into the photographs, I want to add a few words on gardening and cooking from a garden as a practice and meditation. So here's the philosophical part. I find that this attitude carries through to my cooking as well as my gardening. And for helping to see this, I'm particularly grateful to the book Tomato Blessings and Radish Teachings by Edward S.B. Brown. He also wrote the Tassajara Bread Book. He co-authored the Greens Cookbook. He was a cook at Tassajara Zen Mountain Center for some years. And this book is about his spiritual practice as expressed in his cooking for Tassajara and for himself. Now, I don't meditate, but I do try to practice the Zen Buddhist admonition about putting one's whole being into every task, the chopping wood and carrying water that you need to do to live. In his book, Edward S.B. Brown wrote that he asked Suzuki Roshi, Tassajara's Zen teacher, if he had any advice for him as a cook. And the advice was this: when you wash the rice, wash the rice. When you chop the carrots, chop the carrots. When you stir the soup, stir the soup. Simple, but meaningful to me. The Zen master was saying that one should keep focused on the ingredients and the processes, treat the ingredients well, and do the processes with care. When I garden, I treat the seeds and plants well and tend and harvest them with care. And the result is a meditation of sorts. It results in awareness of the earth and its seasonal bounty and our dependence upon it. And it's joyous to do gardening or cooking well. As Brown says, where previously you waited for the world to provide entertainment or solace, here you enter a world vibrant with the energy and devotion flowing out of your own being. And you produce food. Through gardening, you produce raw ingredients, or through cooking, the finished dishes. So in the end, through gardening and cooking, you treat yourself well and anyone who shares food with you. Brown gives us a number of recipes in Tomato Blessings and Radish Teachings. And here's, oh, I don't know how to advance this. I advanced, it didn't advance. How do I advance my pictures? Oh, there, it advanced. Okay, this is a picture of the cover of Tomato Blessings and Radish Teachings, and he gives you a number of simple dishes he likes, not that you would want to master to impress people, but that he just enjoys eating them. They often include garden produce such as Swiss chard or zucchini, but the approach is as important as the exact recipes. Whether or not you make his recipes or read the book all the way through or read it here and there for its charm and encouragement, I hope you will also find it valuable. What Brown did in his book, I did in Golden Gate Gardening. I tried to give you recipes that were useful as you pass through the year and through the different seasons of crops. And they're the ones that I return to when I have those crops. I was thrilled to read Brown's thoughts on chopping food. And I love this picture because he's waxing poetic about chopping. He's got his knife in hand and he has a very sweet little smile on his face, and he's talking about how to chop food. He likes to chop things on the diagonal because he says if you expose more surface, more flavor is released from the food. And that's one reason to chop foods. That's not the only reason. Another is appearance. Carefully chopped food in aesthetic shapes makes food more appealing to eat. Chopping is definitely for me a spiritual practice, a way that I treat the ingredients well in order to treat myself and those who dine with me well. So one thing you can do is chop them at the table. In Western cooking, a lot of types of food are left whole in order to be chopped at the table. There's a different philosophy in Asian cooking, which is to chop, 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 and then eat. So things are chopped when you get to the table. And an Asian friend has taught me that in Chinese cooking, it's considered best to have things more or less the same size in the dish that you've produced, and add them to the cooking in the order in which they will cook, so that the things that will take the longest go in first. Japanese cooking tends to be more interested in the appearance of the food, so that it's more valuable to them to cut foods into interesting shapes or to leave some of them whole, so that when you look at it, it's an interesting thing to see. Western cooks do chop some foods, especially in soups, stews, or salads, and often, and still another reason for cooking, for chopping comes into play, and that is that cutting foods up lets you take a mouthful of several different foods in one bite and enjoy the mixing of their flavors. So the balance of the different ingredients is important, but also the size of the pieces. If I'm making a salad, I'll tear the lettuce leaves into fairly large pieces. And then if I'm not sure of the taste of the preference of the eaters, I will cut the things that are stronger flavored into smaller pieces so that nobody's palate will be shocked by something that's strong flavored. And if I'm cooking vegetable soup, I don't want a chunk of potato to be so big that it's impossible to taste it at the same time that you're tasting the other ingredients of the soup, for example. So you don't want that potato to be dominant in any bite. So I want several ingredients in each spoonful of soup that one is able to eat. In an omelet, I want the pieces of vegetables or herbs to be small enough that when you eat the omelet, you get a little of something and a little of something else in the same bite. You're not just getting one thing. But despite our best efforts, and to finish talking about how to use what we cook well, we sometimes produce more in a garden than we can use. And when this happens, I feel a disquiet that interrupts my feeling of the rightness of growing food. I have produced food that did not exist in the world before I grew it. And I feel it's my responsibility to make sure someone eats it. I preserve very little, partly due to a very busy life. And so I want to give away as much produce as I can. And I start with family, friends, and neighbors. Then I consider nonprofits. For some years when I taught at City College, I gave a lot of produce from our demonstration garden to my students to take home and try recipes, see what they like to eat. But when there were no students actively in the class, then I would take a lot of extra food to a nonprofit that fed seniors lunch, and they would be so happy. They would smile and wave with approval. I would bring in chard and collards and lettuce and herbs, and when they were in season, I would bring in extra apples. I always try to make sure that the apples from our tree go to somebody to eat, all of them. And since then, I've discovered the free farm stand, which is in San Francisco, and will take all sorts of small donations of backyard produce. And so I've given you a list on your handout, places to donate garden produce, and also gleaning and harvesting help. Sometimes the biggest problems are leafy greens and fruit. And there are institutions in many counties. San Francisco has the farm stand, which will organize gleaners for fruit trees. And the Department of Public Works also will just send people out to help you harvest what you've grown. They also look for volunteers, including teenagers. So, and there's a website there called Village Harvest, which serves the greater Bay Area, and they will help you find and connect to someone who will harvest or someplace that you can volunteer to harvest. And because fruit is often a problem, I've included the reference for the book To Grow a Little Fruit Tree by Anne Ralph. Anne Ralph wrote this book to help people grow a fruit tree and prune it. So even a full-size tree, not necessarily a dwarf tree, but prune it so that you can reach it. She says you should be able to, while standing, reach to the top of it and harvest so that you're not having to climb around on ladders, and leave the lower limbs on. Don't ever cut them off, because that's where you can get the fruit without having to climb a ladder. But also just how to make it smaller so that you don't have to reach too far to get your fruit. So there are other reasons to garden. Planting for pollinators is a great one. Studies show it's not only native plants that attract pollinators. If you do a little study, you find that there's a lot of beautiful native and non-native flowers that attract pollinators, which will help your vegetable and fruits to produce more crops. I enjoy the bees and the other beneficial insects that come to my flowering plants, and I grow other flowering plants that I just like to look at. I know they don't pollinate. Nothing pollinates them, but they're beautiful. And I have written about ornamentals on my blog, and you can find the address of my blog at the bottom of the handouts. It's also in the back of the book, Golden Gate Gardening. And I've written a different book called Wildly Successful Plants, which features 50 ornamentals. 49 of them are drought tolerant. They're all very easy to grow in the Bay Area. And most of them are deer proof. Many of them are snail proof. And so I recommend that as both the books and the blog. And there's a chapter in Golden Gate Gardening on cutting gardens, on growing flowers for cutting in the Bay Area. We have a little bit different list of perennials that grow well here than grow in the eastern cold winter areas. So now let's look at some photos of some different local crops and the recipes that one can cook from them. And I'm going to see if I can make you hungry for lunch, or at least inspire you to use your harvest better. And I'm going to start with a list of crops that a gardener gets to enjoy that the shopper doesn't see, or doesn't get to enjoy as well. And I'm starting with snap peas, which I know are purchasable. They're relatively pricey, but you can buy them. But when I see them in the market, I see that they're usually rather flat. They do not allow them to develop into fat, juicy peas. And even though you can eat the pod as well as the pea, when the pea is larger, it's the sweetest part of that crop. And so the home gardener can let it get a little bigger, a little fatter, a little sweeter. So that's why that's in there, because it's a wonderful crop that you can enjoy much more by growing your own. These are collard tips, or flowering tips. After the winter, collards, cabbage if you cut the central head, kale, although I don't like it as well, but they will all make little flowering stems. It's like mini broccolis. And you can break these off while they're still tender and before the buds open, and you can use them like collards, or you can use them like broccoli rabe, or you can use them like gailan, depending upon your ethnic cooking preference. Here is, these are the tips of collards. They're flowering tips of collards, and they have been sauteed and seasoned with oyster sauce, the way you would cook gailan or Chinese broccoli. And I have reserved some very lightly sauteed ginger and garlic, chopped up fine, that I will now throw upon that now that it's cooked, and eat it that way. This is one that most people don't know at all. It is called Yakon, or Bolivian sunroot. The left is the leaves. The plant grows about 6 feet tall. It's a perennial, but it dies back in the winter. I gave one to my neighbor in a pot, and she reported to me that it had died, that she had somehow killed it. She was devastated, but in fact, she didn't. It just died back. That's what they do in the winter. So after the top dies back, you dig it up, and even in a pot, it would make a big pot, it would make what you see on the right. At the top are the rhizomes, and that's what the plant propagates from. Can I use my arrow there? Does that show? That's you can plant even a very small little rhizome like that will grow roots in a single year. And below it, hanging off of it, are these roots that are, I call them watermelon jicama, because they're kind of like jicama, but they're more tender. They're a little bit sweet. They're really crispy and crunchy, and everyone who has tried them has liked to eat it raw. So that's Yakon. And this is a wild edible that gardeners enjoy, that most people don't know about. If they know about it at all, they think it's a weed. This is a wild onion, Allium Triquetrum. You can hear the the 3 in there. Some people call it 3-cornered leek, because the stem of the flowers is triangular in cross section, and the leaves all have this little ridge on the back of them. It is on the undersides. It smells strongly of onion. Don't eat something that doesn't smell strongly of onion. But it's harvestable from about December through April, and then it's dormant in the summer. And if you have it I suggest that you dig it and put it all in one place so that you can keep it together and not have it running all over your garden. If you have it all over your garden, start eating. It's really good. Here I've used it in fish and seafood sauce, which the recipe is on my blog. And I've used mussels in here because I'm allergic to shrimp. You can use shrimp. And I've streamlined the recipe, which I got, I think I've told you which cookbook it came from on the blog, but I streamlined it so that it's really easy to prepare and it is quite delicious. Another use for the wild onion is to make a soup stock. It could be chicken or beef or vegetarian, but the vegetables in this particular one are the wild onion and parsley and some oregano in the lower right, and then just to the left of that some thyme, and then a bay leaf, which is also fresh harvested, or it's been harvested and pressed until it was flat and dry, and then put in a jar and used that way. You can also use leek leaves, which gardeners have lots of. They cut them all off or they cut them down when you buy them in the grocery, but a gardener is going to have a lot of leek leaf because they're really long leaves. You can use the tops of carrots. It's a good idea in a soup stock to have something from the onion family and something from the parsley or carrot family, and then some herbs and a bay leaf. And then you strain all this out. You don't eat that. You strain it out and it flavors the broth and it makes a really nice soup. Miner's lettuce is another native. This is a native green. This is another wild green. Onion, the wild onion is wild, but it's not native. It's from the Mediterranean. And miner's lettuce, sometimes people call it Indian lettuce. I'm not sure that's a great improvement, but it is a edible wild native plant, which is very crispy and mild flavored and delicious in salads. And it's again harvestable from about December through April. You can go out and find a wild stand in April, and I've told you on my blog how to save seed from it. You can also buy seed. Here's a Grand Slam winter salad that's made almost entirely from weeds and edible flowers. So you can see the wild onion flowers in there. You can see variegated nasturtium leaves and nasturtium flowers. And this is something that I've often made in the autumn. You can also probably make it in the spring. There's weeds in the garden in the summer that are edible also, such as the ones that are in this salad. This one has lots of purslane, and it has chickweed, and it has lamb's quarters. Lamb's quarters is used as a cooked green in Mexico, and purslane is used all around the world and considered a vegetable. You can buy seed for a larger leaved version of it. But and also the chickweed is good when it's winter, especially good because or when your soil is well watered and particularly high in nutrients, because then you're going to have a larger leaf. Gardeners have access to all sorts of edible flowers. And some of these are some of the most common ones. And you can see some of them are actually vegetables. Here's a mustard, which is flowering on the left. And then calendula. I usually pull the petals off to put them into a salad. The viola, the Johnny Jump Up. And then the white flowers to the right of that are arugula, which taste like arugula. And then there's the nasturtium flowers. They're mostly for joie de vivre, they can cheer you up quite a bit. This salad had in it abutilon flowers and forget-me-not and a viola and some English daisies. And these particular flowers don't add a lot of flavor, but they certainly are pretty in a salad. Gardeners can also have access to plenty of herbs, including all the common ones, which you buy as little plants because they take so long from seed, and you also want to be able to take a sniff of it before you buy it and make sure it's the scent that you want. But they also have access to some really unusual ones. This is Calaminta Nepita or Nepatella. It's a northern Italian herb that has a flavor that's somewhere between pennyroyal and oregano. And when you look for recipes in Italian cookbooks and you see that they've called for mint or they've called for oregano, frequently they'll be actually calling for this plant, but they don't think you know about it. That's Tagetes lucida, which is a Mexican tarragon. It's a hardier plant that doesn't mind our mild winters, although it does go semi-dormant eventually. But it has a flavor which is quite similar to French tarragon, perhaps a little bolder, and it's sweet. It makes a really interesting, mysterious flavor when you add it to a salad. We can also grow quite a few basils that you will not find on the market. This is wild mountain. That's not what that is. And see, I cannot read all of my slide. Can you tell me what that says? No, okay.
Yes.
Wild magic. Wild magic.
Yes, it says wild magic basil.
Yeah, there's another one called mountain magic, and that's not the same thing. It's similar, but it's not the same. So I recommend wild magic. It seems to have some holy basil in it, some tulsi, and it has a very fruity flavor. And it actually will do this. This is in my backyard in a pot, and it's in an area that's pretty foggy and cold in the summer, and it will actually make a sizable plant that you can harvest from. And here is African blue basil, again, growing in a foggy neighborhood. So these are two basils that will grow fairly well in a cold neighborhood. They make pretty good pesto. It's interesting. All basils, many basils have different flavors from one another, and these are a little different from your Genovese, but they're quite delicious. And African blue basil growing in a sunny part of the region will grow into a large shrub up to 4 feet tall. Sometimes with a little pruning, it comes through the winter, several winters. It attracts helpful insects. It attracts all sorts of helpful insects. I go out and I cut back. This is kind of early in the season, this picture, but eventually it'll be covered with lavender flowers. And I will go back and take out the spent flowering stems because they are no longer going to attract beneficials, and they will reduce the amount of flowering that the plant does, but it's quite ornamental. We can grow quite a lot in a small space of parsley. This is a giant Italian parsley, a flat leaf that is good for chopping up into the garden, into your foods. It's much handier to have it in your garden than to go out and buy a bunch of parsley that you then have to think about, how am I going to use this up? Am I going to keep it in a vase of water? Am I going to keep it in the refrigerator? But if you have it in your garden, you just get it when you need it. And you can use it for a lot of recipes that use a bit of parsley. This is a garbanzo salad. The recipe is on my blog. Many Middle Eastern salads and soups. In fact, there are Middle Eastern soups that contain quite a bit of parsley and other strong flavored greens, which become much milder when they're cooked. I chop the parsley by using either kitchen scissors or a knife to chop it coarsely, and then I use a mezzaluna to finish the chopping, which is a moon-shaped or rounded cutting blade that I rock back and forth in a bowl, but you can buy them. You can also find some that have double blades, which would even go faster, but there are many ways to chop your parsley or your other herbs. Here is another recipe that uses chopped parsley. In the bowl, you can see in the lower right is chopped parsley. In the lower left are chopped green onions. In the upper left is mayonnaise. And I found that low-fat mayonnaise works fine, but vegan doesn't work in this recipe. And then there's some Parmesan cheese, and the tomatoes are mid-sized tomatoes, not cherry and not large. The kind that these are a kind that grow pretty well throughout our region. And so in the right side of the screen, you see it stuffed. It's ready to go into a broiler. And here they are broiled. They are delicious. They can be used as a hors d'oeuvre, or they can be used as a side dish because they're that versatile. Here's another recipe for something you may grow. That's a bull's blood beet on the left, a mighty beet, which I found that bull's blood doesn't get leaf miner as much as some other beets. So that's the one that I love to grow. And the salad is raw. And so it's a raw food dish. And the blending of the sour, the lemon juice or vinegar in the dressing and the sweet of the beet will blend. And the next day it'll even be better. It's sort of a sweet sour thing. And it has dill in it and onion and garlic. And you can also use your vegetables to make desserts. This is a chocolate beet cake. The recipe is in Golden Gate Gardening. You can also make it with carrot or zucchini. I find it infinitely better than zucchini bread because I like chocolate. The editor of Golden Gate Gardening said, "Don't you want to ice that cake?" And I thought, no, I don't want to ice that cake because you just cut it up and eat it. It's low cholesterol because it's made with an oil rather than with a solid fat. Not low sugar, not low fat, but it is low cholesterol. And if you make it with eggs, with an egg substitute, it could be vegan, I guess. Another thing to do with summer vegetables when you have a lot is to make something like this. This is a tian. It's layered. This one has yellow squash and red tomatoes in it, and then lots of parsley and breadcrumbs and Parmesan and olive oil. And boy, is it good. You just bake it up and it tastes really good. That book, Fast, Fresh, and Green, is on your list, and it's a good one. These are zucchini cottage cheese fritters. You can make fritters if you have lots of zucchini. You can make it with or without cottage cheese. You can make it with chayote squash instead of with zucchini, if you have that. You could even use potatoes, and carrot, you could put carrot in it. So there's lots of, I think this one has some carrot. When I have a lot of chard, I have recipes for using it. When I first came to the city, I grew chard and I liked it, but I kind of got tired of it. And then I learned to do some new things with it. So I'm pleased to discover that there are new ways to do it. This is called Bright Lights because it has all the different colors of stem. I plant my chard in September and I cover it with a row cover. As you can see, it's been tucked firmly into the soil. I make a trench around it and tuck that in so that the leaf miners can't get in. And the leaf miners then become dormant during the fall. Used to be by mid-October. These days, because of climate change, it's being a little bit later, but certainly by November. And then you can harvest the chard during the winter, and it will continue to be harvestable until it begins to flower in the end of March. So you get a good season out of it. And this is one of the things that I learned to do with it. It's sauteed. I sauteed the onions first and then the greens. And also I cut the stems up and microwaved them for 2 minutes on high and then put them back in the dish. And there's some pine nuts in there. And here is a way to remove the stems from the chard using kitchen scissors. So they're a good garden. They're a good tool for having in the kitchen. These are Vietnamese style vegetables. The recipe is on your handout. It's a wonderful thing to have a recipe like this. This one has in it, as you can see in the lower right, it has some wild onion and some celery and carrot. And then it calls for Chinese cabbage, but I found that you can chop up Western cabbage and use that instead if you wish. The peanuts are served on top of it. It has a little bit of fish sauce in it, which gives it a little bit of a saltiness and a savory umami sort of flavor. I don't have enough room to grow a lot of mustard more than a couple of times a year, but when I grow it, I enjoy it. This is in a large, wide pot growing in my backyard, and it's a very pretty open pollinated mustard variety. As you can see, it's got a lot of purple in it. So when I have it, I fill a skillet with mustard chopped up, and I serve it with tofu and noodles, Asian style noodles, seasoned with soy sauce and sesame oil. And it is a very satisfying dish. Very, you feel that you certainly have had lunch or had dinner when you have had this. I can produce a lot of arugula in a small space. Very productive. It's this is the winter arugula. I have a wild arugula that has perennialized in my garden and comes up wild every summer. So I have a little bit of a rotation going on, but this is my winter arugula. I know that some people love arugula and other people hate it. And so there's plenty of room for both. And what I discovered is that when it's cooked, arugula has a very mild flavor. It's just like any other green. In fact, for this dish, I could substitute, I could mix arugula with other greens and it would be fine. Nobody would know the difference. But I've cooked some onions and then some arugula and other greens. And I've made a paste out of feta cheese, mashing it in a bowl so that it's more liquidy. This recipe is on your handout. It's also in an abbreviated form in Golden Gate Gardening, but on your handout, it's more written out. Boiled some ravioli. I like to buy the frozen ones because they're less expensive than the fresh ones, and make this dish. You can use other greens too. And when I have a lot of cucumbers in the summer, if you can grow cucumbers, try this one. It's called Burpless Tasty Green. It's a long Asian type that does well in our region. Some of them don't, like Suyu Long needs more heat. So you could grow that inland, but if you live in a reasonably mild portion of the region that's near the coast, try Burpless Tasty Green. And these ingredients include here these are homegrown onions. They're small. I grew some huge ones this year, but last year I had some small ones 2 years ago. And the cilantro has started to flower, but that's okay. People feel that they have to stop eating it if it doesn't look like what it's in the grocery, but it's okay to have some flowers. I've cracked the peanuts, didn't really pulverize them, but I cracked them in a small mortar and pestle that I've made myself from ceramic. And here's the salad. It has some onion in it. It has the cilantro on top, the peanuts. You can put a little hot pepper in it if you want. And it's the dressing has no fat whatsoever. So it's an excellent low-fat dish. And soups are a really good idea for garden cooking. This is one on page 154 of a book called The Best Soups in the World, which is on your list. Clifford Wright is an expert on Mediterranean cooking. And there's this one on 154 includes carrots and cabbage, and it has in it these large white runner beans, which I grow. And then I've backed it up with a few small white beans, which he recommends. But the runner beans are actually a substitute for favas, which I didn't have, but they work just fine. And there's another recipe in that book on page 152, which is also excellent. And I've also substituted the large white beans for that. And it has some fennel in it. And it's the way that I discovered that fennel doesn't have the anisey flavor that the raw fennel does when you cook it. And it becomes a quite unique vegetable, has a wonderful flavor. It flavors the broth really well and is not anisey at all. So those of you who love anisey fennel, have it in your salad raw. And if you're not fond of it, find a way to cook it because it's a wonderful crop. This is a very fast soup. It's a good way to use up your summer zucchini, but you can mix other vegetables into it. It doesn't have to be this particular set of vegetables. But the main thing is that it's fast and you can just have it on the table in no time for lunch. This is on your handout. It's a recipe for tomato soup, which is going to be much tastier and more nutritious than Campbell's tomato soup. And I have a little lemon tree, so the strip of lemon peel that goes into it is from that tree, so it's organically grown, and a bay leaf and some carrots. And so it's a really good thing to do if you've got a lot of tomatoes by chance, or if you have a lot of carrots. That doesn't matter, either one will do fine, or if you have both. Lettuce and salad. Lettuce salad is easy for a gardener. Leafy lettuce kind of grows all year. In the inland areas, it's hot in the summer, put it in the shade. You might have to take a break from lettuce, but you can try Malabar spinach and some of these other hot season greens that are mild and would work in a salad. Crisp heads are more like iceberg, but not iceberg, because you can see they're greener. This one is tinged with bronze, and it is best grown in the spring. But here are salads from different seasons. I always try to add something to give a little color. So the one in the upper, the ones on the left both have different kinds of broccoli. The bottom one is Romanesco. Some people call it cauliflower. One on the top is just regular broccoli that's lightly steamed before I put it in. But the one at the top left is a winter salad, and it has in it some red cabbage, purple cabbage, and some red stems of chard, which I think of as kind of a vegetable graffiti on a salad. The one on the lower left has ruby streaks, which is a red mustard. And then the ones on the right are warm season salads, and they have more flowers. And the one down below, you can tell that's in May because it has the pink petals of Dianthus plumarius in it, and that's a May crop. Pansies and violas are both edible, but I like the violas better because they're smaller. You don't have to tear them up. You get a whole big pansy on a salad. It's a little overwhelming. Don't have a whole lot of flavor. Somebody said mildly wintergreen, and I tasted one carefully, and I said, well, really mildly wintergreen. But the nasturtium here on the upper left has a very spicy flavor, and then a little bit of sweetness at the back. One of the recipes in Golden Gate Gardening is for stuffing it with cream cheese with curry powder in it, which gives you quite an interesting blend of flavors. And I found that everybody seems to like it, even children. And the upper right are these very stylish blossoms of fava beans. And then there's the yellow mustard and the lavender of an African basil. Some edible flowers are ornamentals as well. Here is a rose, a fuchsia, that's Mendonoma bells. It's a mite-resistant fuchsia. Forget-me-not, and there's a dianthus. Just remember that if you're eating flowers, only eat flowers that you have found on a reliable list of flowers that are edible, and do not eat flowers if you feel that there's a chance that they have been sprayed with any kind of pesticide in the recent past. So be cautious of that. So if you're buying it and planning to eat it right away, you'd want to be sure that it was grown organically before you started eating it. Roasting, my last topic on eating your crops, is a really neat way to cook vegetables that's fairly recently come into ascendance. And it's makes just about any vegetable taste better. This is a mixture of vegetables. You kind of put whatever root vegetables you've got in, and this one requires you to turn it while it's cooking. Most of them don't. The book Fast, Fresh, and Green has a really helpful table of how to chop and how to roast different kinds of vegetables. In this case, I had carrots and a parsnip that grew in my garden. I volunteered there, and it was like, oh, okay, fine. So I combined it with some garlic and onions and potatoes that I had purchased, and made this mix. These are oven roasted Romano beans, and your handout also has a recipe for oven roasted fava pods when they're small, before the fava beans have formed. these are quite delicious. So the basic recipe for roasting is a couple of tablespoons of olive oil and turn everything in it and roast it until it's becomes somewhat browned. This removes some of the moisture and gives you a little bit of browning, and that makes everything taste better than it would if you hadn't done that. And finally, I have oven roasted cauliflower. I have dusted this with a Cajun spice mix, and it is quite delicious. So that's the end of my slideshow. Are you getting hungry? I hope so. And if so, that's good. And I'm putting up a slide from an early July harvest from my 8x8 feet to show you what is possible. It's a community garden plot, and I've found that by growing vegetables over the years, that learning to grow the crops is one skill and learning to use the crops is a different skill. And so today I've tried to help you make the connection between the two and use more of what you eat. And I hope that I filled you with ideas that are for using what you grow and the inspiration to prepare the dishes. So happy gardening, happy eating to you all. And if there are any questions, I shall be glad to try to answer them. So I should stop sharing. Okay.
Hi, Pam.
Any
Caleb
questions?
has a question for you. Does Pam grow most of her veggies from starts or from seed, especially plants like carrots and beets versus squash and tomatoes?
Carrots really cannot be grown from starts. I have a funny story about it because I once ran into some gardeners at the community garden who were very busily transplanting carrots. Now it was a misty, cool day and they survived. I said, you really can't grow carrots from starts. And I learned to keep my mouth shut because they were taken aback and said, oh, of course you can. Well, they were right in the sense that the carrots survived, but they were wrong in the sense that the carrots did not make roots. Beets are somewhere in between. You can start them from seed or you can start them from starts if you're careful. Squash grows so fast that starting it from seed, well, if you do that indoors, you want to get it out into the garden before the roots find the edge of the pot, because that will stunt the plant if it does. The same is true of beans and peas and some other fast growing things. Tomatoes, I always start inside myself or purchase them because they take a long time to grow, and you want to get the best start that you can. There's a chart in Golden Gate Gardening. I think it tells you what you might want to start from seed and what you might want to start from plants, and whether you want to start indoors or outdoors and why you want to do it. Are you going to protect it from pests by doing that, or are you going to give it a faster start? What is your purpose? So other than the fact that some things cannot be started from seed, it tells you, from plants, from transplants, it tells you what the best time to and best way to start it is.
Thank you for that. Ben asks, are you gardening year round in your garden plot or just in the summertime?
I am definitely gardening year round. And I don't know if you still have that recording somewhere on your site, but I gave it, my lecture, the last lecture I gave for Sloat was how to plant for the secret season, which is January through March, how to plant in the secret season and for the secret season. And I call it that because most people are not aware of it, but it's a really good time to plant. And usually we have some rain in that period. Certainly the soil is already moist. You don't have to moisten it to plant. So I grow things all year, different things.
And most of our previous webinars are available on the website. Just go to the Learn tab and then to the webinars, and you can find the previous webinars to watch.
I thought they
were. Linda is using a cold frame and wonders about your experience with cold frames. she's growing some Bates collards or kale, it looks like, some lacinato kale, perpetual rhubarb, thyme, oregano, Genovese basil this time of year. Interesting. Sage and parsley.
Where is she gardening? Did she tell you?
No, I don't have her location.
Okay. Well, I didn't use a cold frame for many years. I have one out there now, and the reason I didn't is because the main use of the cold frame in cold winter gardens is to start crops early in the spring, before it's warm. And I have done that indoors, so I haven't felt a need for it. And the problem with cold frames or greenhouses for that matter is that they can overheat. So I have a cold frame, and when the sun is on it, and the sun has now returned to that part of my garden, so I have to, from the winter shade, so I have to go out there and open it up during the day, or everything would fry. So it's a mixed blessing, I think. I grew some nice spinach there in the fall a couple of years ago, but you have to think about overheating as well as underheating if you have a cold frame.
Linda says, yeah, she's in Glen Park, so in San Francisco, and she's pretty sophisticated. She has a Wi-Fi humidity and temperature sensor in her cold frame. So I think she's ahead of most of us.
Sophisticated and well-heeled. That's good. That's very good. All right. I can't hear you now.
I'm sorry, I have to press the space bar here to temporarily unmute myself, and I forgot to do that.
Oh, okay. I could tell you were talking.
I don't see any other questions, and so I think we'll wrap it up with our thanks as usual to you for a terrific presentation. This webinar will be, the recording will be available on our website on Tuesday. And don't forget the upcoming webinars, and I'm sure we'll see Pam back here again, hopefully before too long, with some more gardening adventures. And thank you all very much. Jen, do you want to share anything with us?
Oh, hi. No, I think I'm super hungry now. I want like everything that you shared.
I was thinking.
Or when are we all going to go over to your house and have a dinner party or something? I mean, that just looked incredible. So definitely inspired. Thank you, Pam, for your expertise and your time and whatnot.
You're very welcome. That's what I was thinking, is everyone's too hungry to ask a question.
Which is good. We can go out and grow everything to make those recipes now. So
that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we're ready for lunch. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.